Kia ora. Welcome all. Benvenuti. Benvenuti a Bologna, those of you who are here. And welcome to those of you who are joining remotely. I was just waiting for the room to silence a little bit, which is great that there's such a buzzing community of people in front of me physically, as well as I know some of you here joining remotely. Tonight's panel is part of the IR seminar series. It's titled Reimagining New Zealand's Role in the World. I'm Nina Hall. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Assistant Professor of International Relations here at SAIS Bologna. But I'm also wearing a couple of other hats in today's panel. I'm the chair of and the moderator of tonight's panel, but I'm also the editor of the book for which the panel is focused on, Beyond These Shores, Aotearoa and the World. And the book brings together a diverse range of thinkers to reimagine New Zealand's role in the world. And today we'll hear from 4 of those contributors, and there are 3 others who won't be joining us. And I'll introduce those other contributors, 2 of whom you can see joining live here, Max Harris and Fairlie Chappuis. I'll introduce them in more detail shortly. But first, I wanted to just give those of you who maybe don't know a lot about New Zealand a little bit more clarity about why it's important to be discussing and rethinking New Zealand foreign policy. And there are at least 3 reasons, I think, to do so. The first, of course, for students of international relations, as many of you are, it's important to look not just at the big players like the US or China, but also to look at the role and influence of small states. There are, after all, many more small states than there are great powers. And many of you in the room may even come from a country that's not considered a great power. Out of interest, how many of you would consider you come from a smaller country? Okay, yeah, 3, 4, at least in the room. But much of international relations theorizing has traditionally focused on the great powers. Yet I think in today's tricky world of geopolitics, it's important and interesting to ask, how do smaller countries such as New Zealand, with a population of 5.5 million, navigate these tricky waters of geopolitics? Secondly, New Zealand is important to study because it's often portrayed as an international role model of effective and progressive governance. Many of you will have heard of Jacinda Ardern, who is the current Prime Minister and is regularly praised by international media. She's pushed for a politics of kindness in the United Nations. She's responded strongly against a white supremacist murder who murdered 51 Muslims in Christchurch in March of last year, 2019. New Zealand's response to COVID has been widely applauded in the international press, as it's been much more effective than many other countries. And Jacinda Ardern is actually up for re-election in a couple of weeks' time in mid-October. And she has quite a healthy lead in the current polls and may even win a majority, which would be unheard of in our mixed member proportional system. But here's where the but comes. As the authors in this book show, there are still significant problems with New Zealand's role in the world, which are not commonly discussed, either in New Zealand or outside. These are tied to New Zealand's colonial past, to New Zealand's historical alliances. For instance, New Zealand has been very linked to the UK and has been part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. New Zealand has also had colonies in the Pacific and is struggling to tackle effects of colonization on Maori. In short, the speakers on this panel will also probably challenge your assumptions about New Zealand as a role model of progressive leadership. And I think that's important to hold up some assumptions and things that you might read about in popular press and really look at them closely. Thirdly, and I think this is true not just for New Zealand politics, but something we need more generally, is that engaging in an important exercise of reimagining a better world. It's even more vital now during times of COVID, when many international borders are closed, international collaboration seems limited, and many world leaders, as well as many publics, are looking inwards. So we need to be collectively developing new visions for our world. And to do this, we need to broaden the conversation beyond the traditional, conventional foreign policy thinkers who are often, although not always, but often white, middle class, urban, male elite. And we, in this book, try to go beyond these thinkers and include others in the conversation and to think beyond diplomatic, but also look at state, people-to-people relations, not just state-to-state. So for these three reasons, looking at the role of small states, really challenging this question of whether or not New Zealand really is a progressive leader, and the need for reimagining new futures and for a broader range of voices, I pulled together this book and also this panel. I'm now going to introduce the speakers. Now I'll note that two of them have sent in videos because it is 5:30 a.m. in the morning, New Zealand time, so they won't be joining us live, and two of the speakers are joining us live, who you can see. So the first speaker that I'm going to introduce is Tulia Thompson, whose video you'll see up first. Tulia is a New Zealand-born Fijian, Tongan, Pākehā queer feminist writer living in Aotearoa, which is the Maori name for New Zealand. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and her doctoral thesis was called Queer Lives in Fiji, and it was about marginalization of sexual minorities in Fiji. Before completing her PhD, she worked briefly at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where I actually worked briefly alongside her. But she's also has a career as a creative writer. She's studied under two very famous New Zealand writers, Witi Ihamaira and Albert Wendt, and published a children's book, Joseph and the Vu, by Huia in 2007. So she will join us via video, unfortunately not live. Tina Ngata, the second speaker who will join us also by video because she's also in New Zealand, is a Ngāti Porou mother of two from the east coast of Te Ika a Maui. Te Ika Maui is the Maori name for the North Island. Her work involves advocacy for environment, Indigenous and human rights, and includes local, national and international initiatives highlighting the role of settler colonialism in issues such as climate change and waste pollution. Her work also promotes Indigenous conservation as best practice for globally sustainable future. And then I'd like to introduce the two speakers who you can see here. Welcome to you both. Fairlie Chappuis is an associated researcher at the Peace Building Analysis and Impact Program, where she analyzes the sociology of international peace building, urban peace and security, and the socioeconomic dimensions of violence and peace building and methodologies for peace and conflict studies, as well as her specialization in security sector reform. She holds a PhD in political science from the Freie Universität Berlin, and she's previously worked at the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, the Stimson Center, and the Kofi Annan Institute for Conflict Transformation. She also studied at Auckland University, which is where I got to know Fairlie, and she's published work in international peacekeeping, Journal of Intervention, and state building, Parcours Anthropologique, and other academic journals. She has a real wide range of expertise on areas including West Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central America. And a SAIS student has actually in past worked with her as a research assistant, so she has a connection to SAIS too. Thanks for joining us from Switzerland, Fairlie. From the Swiss mountains even, I assume. And then Max Harris is an examination fellow at All Souls College. He completed his BA LLB Hons at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, during which time he spent short stints working for the South Australian Department of Premier and Cabinet and the American Civil Liberties Union. He then worked as a judge's clerk for Chief Justice Elias of the Supreme Court of New Zealand before completing his BCL and MMPP degrees at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. Harris has also worked a lot on criminal justice advocacy, helping to set up the group Just Speak in New Zealand, which has a very powerful role, I should say, in New Zealand today. And it works to encourage young people to speak up for a more humane criminal justice system. And Max, thanks for joining us from the UK, from London. Great. So in terms of the format for tonight's panel, it is slightly unusual for those of you in the room and those of you joining remotely. As I said, we're going to have two videos. I've posed questions to all of the speakers, just as I did in the book. I've asked them to think of an issue or a relationship that they want to see differently and to imagine what that would look like differently between New Zealand and the world. So each speaker has at least one question they'll respond to. We'll start with Tulia, then followed by Tina, and then I'll talk with Max and Fairlie a little bit more in an interactive conversation for about half an hour. I've got some questions for them before I turn over to you. So please, both online, those of you joining via Zoom, and those of you in the room, we welcome your questions, and we'll certainly have time for them towards the end. So for the first question that I wanted to ask was a question for Tulia. And in Tulia's chapter in this book, she suggests that New Zealand has not recognised the harms we've done to the Pacific Islands, through colonisation. And I said to her, can you tell us more about what these harms are and how New Zealand should address them? And I also said, can you explain what you mean by coral consciousness? Coral consciousness is a concept that she develops in this chapter, and she goes on to explain it. So thanks, if we can listen to Tulia's video.
Nisan Buluvanaka, kia ora tātou. My name is Dr. Tulia Thompson, and I'm talking about my piece, Coral Consciousness, which is an essay in Beyond These Shores, which is being launched tonight. In my piece, I talk about the harm that New Zealand has caused in the Pacific. But this is something that New Zealanders don't necessarily understand or talk about, because they often think New Zealand's role in the Pacific was benevolent and helpful, especially in terms of giving aid. And what I argue instead is that New Zealand's role in the Pacific has often been as a colonial administrator, and our role as colonial administrator meant that we were there helping corporates extract resources. In New Zealand, we often think of colonization as settler colonization, where one people go into the territory of another, but instead what happens in the Pacific was corporate colonization, which meant that big corporates extracted resources and labor. And so New Zealand's role was far from benign. It was a role that was economically motivated, and also because we thought it would put us in good stead with Great Britain, who was a colonial force. So the harm that New Zealand caused in the Pacific has had lasting impact. Particular environments were damaged very badly, particularly by phosphate mining. But also there was an ongoing racism implicit in a lot of New Zealand's policy. And so this is something that New Zealand still needs to address, particularly when it thinks about engaging with countries in the Moana region in a respectful and reciprocal way. So my piece in the collection is called Coral Consciousness because I intended it as a provocation to New Zealanders to think about our relationship with the Pacific differently. Our relationship with the Pacific is one where we gain trade. It's a valuable market for us. That trade relationship is unequal, or else it's kind of, the Pacific is thought about in a more imaginative way as a holiday destination. And what I'm saying instead is that we could think about our relationship with the Pacific in Pacific terms, and in terms of Pacific values and Pacific knowledge. And so there are two things that I think are really important. And so I wrote my piece as a person that descends from Benga Island, which is a tiny island in Viti or Fiji. Fiji is made up of 330 islands and 500 islets. And so coral is entirely essential to the way people in Fiji live their lives. Coral is what creates our islands. We fish from the reef systems surrounding the islands, And people often, in villages, often rely on subsistence fishing to live. Coral consciousness would be using the risk scale demanded by coral to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees as the thing that governs our emissions targets, instead of basing it on things like GDP. New Zealand is a country that sees itself in relationship to its agricultural heritage, which is also a colonial heritage, and and especially in relation to its dairy industry. And this isn't we need to kind of really rethink that in terms of our relationships that we need to value with other places and with the Pacific. And New Zealand also could be braver in our bilateral relationships with countries that are more powerful than us. We live right next door to a major polluter, and I believe that New Zealand needs to raise climate and the harm that Australia is doing in its bilateral conversations.
Thank you, Tulia. And I know she would love to be here today and, be at least on live. For those of you who aren't familiar with a couple of the words, moana is the Maori word for the Pacific, or the sea, actually, just to clarify the term that Tulia used. So I think Tulia set up a very good starting point, which Tina Ngata also deepens in her contribution both to the book and tonight. And I said to Tina, in your chapter, you discuss the global problem of pollution of the waterways and oceans. What do you mean, Tina, by waste colonialism, and what role in particular do Indigenous peoples have in resolving this issue?
Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the Bologna launch of Beyond These Shores. And while I have this opportunity, I want to acknowledge the loss on your lands over this past year. I am a Ngāti Porou woman, and we maintain our own connection to Italy through the 28th Māori Battalion C Company. The depth of that connection of which is reflected in our annual pilgrimages to Italy to trace the steps and honour the sacrifice and visit the resting places of our papas there. So to those of you who have looked after our loved ones for so many decades now, I wish to acknowledge your pain and the loss of recent times. Nō reira, kia koutou kua whetūrangi tia haere o ki oki atu, hiri noa, kia tātou te hunga ora, tēnā tātou katoa. I've been asked to reflect on what I mean by the term waste colonialism, which I write to in my chapter. I think in order for us to appreciate this term, we need to appreciate colonialism as an experience that plays out across political, economic, and social and psychological dimensions. Colonialism is a tool of imperial expansion, and it necessitates the dehumanizing of others in order to legitimize the stripping of their human rights. The legal legitimizing of human rights abuses can be traced back to early papal bulls of the 15th century, which granted permission for European monarchs to invade, seek out, vanquish, subdue, and commit to perpetual slavery or Saracens and pagans as enemies of Christ. Importantly, it said that they could do this for their profit. And while this is often critiqued as an exercise in Christian domination, I am more of a mind to consider it an economic exercise that used Christianity as a thin mask for the more base human instincts of greed and self-interest. But over time, with the continued application of the doctrine of discovery, which is what these papal laws came to be called, as an international concept, the doctrine of discovery, the idea of entitlement to other spaces, to other bodies for profit became entrenched within international law, within domestic law, within global economic institutions that regulate world debt, that mediate free trade deals, that establish and also arbitrate investor-state dispute settlements, that have been responsible for the deregulation of environmental protections, for the servicing of unjust transnational debt, and the normalizing of these systems of injustice also within the Western psyche. And so, you know, in truth, it has never been acceptable to maintain the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in order to sustain global economic stability, but we do it because we have normalized it. And just like this, it's also a truth that it has never been acceptable to commodify water to the point where 700 million people around the world are likely to be displaced because of water scarcity in the coming decade, but we permit it because we have come to normalize the idea that profit justifies human rights abuses, and so they must certainly justify environmental rights abuses. It is, of course, unacceptable that the dozens of petrochemical plants in St. James, Louisiana, kills so many in the surrounding communities that it's known as Cancer Alley. But we've come to normalize profiteering off of lives, particularly brown and black lives, as is happening in St. James, Louisiana. And so when we say that the entitlement of the plastics industry to the well-being of our water systems, of our oceans, of our food systems, of our very reproductive systems is an extension of our experience of colonization, it is a voice of intimacy with this experience. We recognize as Indigenous peoples the abuse of the social power to inject political bias in favor of these corporations, of these companies and the people that run them. We see how it leverages off of colonial power legacies, such as the creation of international financial institutions, the colonial application of borders, the defining of territories. We see it in multinational food systems, we see it in global information systems, we see it certainly in the oil industry and in its alternative face, the plastics industry. Except now the world is coming to realize that this psychosis of entitlement will not ultimately serve anyone, that colonization is a beast that will eventually, inevitably consume even itself. And an intervention is desperately required to save us all. This is how waste today, as a form of colonialism, an enduring injustice that we must work together to dismantle, but which we would bode well to allow Indigenous people to lead, for who else has demonstrated a 500-year and running record of surviving colonization despite its best efforts. And so with that in mind, I hope that there are some worthy discussions this evening for you in Bologna around how we can work together and support each other in this space, take from our learnings, take from our strengths, take from our triumphs of this generation and previous generations, some of which we share in our spaces between my nation of Ngāti Porou and your nation of Italy. I runga I tēnā, he mihi anō kia koutou, o tēnei wā, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora. Now that we've heard from both Tina and Tulia, I think, some very powerful interventions. We're just trying without the microphone in the room, sorry, because if there's a feedback that's happening. So I'll try and speak up louder. And if you can't hear me, let me know. Sorry about that. So yeah, we've heard some very powerful reflections on New Zealand's role that perhaps challenge some of your assumptions. I know often New Zealand is heralded as, you know, a role model in race relations. I want to open the conversation up further, and feel free to come back to some of these themes, even though obviously Tina and Tulia aren't with us live. But I want to ask Max, whose chapter in the book is entitled New Solidarities, Old Alliances. You're concerned in this book, Max, about New Zealand's Traditionals Alliance. Given that you're sitting right now in London in the UK and you've been there for some time, how can you imagine New Zealand's relationship with the UK, specifically after Brexit?
Kia ora, Nina. Buongiorno to everyone there. Thanks a lot for letting me be part of this conversation. So yeah, one part of the chapter that I've written is about reorienting, New Zealand reorienting away from old alliances, and one of those alliances is with the United Kingdom. And so in answering your question about reimagining New Zealand's relationship, maybe I can say something briefly about the current relationship, why I think there's a need for change, and then how that change might happen. So, and this is very much in the spirit of what Tulia and Tina have already said. At the moment, as many of you will know, New Zealand has a strong relationship with the United Kingdom, which has been built up historically through colonisation and through ongoing relationships across a few different dimensions. So politically, New Zealand's head of state is still the Queen. Economically, the UK remains a very strong trading partner. Culturally, New Zealand still has a lot of news that comes in from the UK. UK news is kind of dominant in New Zealand spaces. Also, New Zealand, a number of New Zealanders, especially those that can afford it, travel to the UK on their OEs or overseas experiences. And militarily and in terms of security, New Zealand has a series of relationships with the UK, which I might come on to later. I guess the argument in the book is that there are good reasons why New Zealand should rethink this relationship, and that actually this strong relationship is out of step with where New Zealand is now and where New Zealand, in my view, should be heading. So there has been some distancing in recent years since the UK joined the European Economic Community in 1973, since New Zealand broke legal links with the Privy Council by establishing its own Supreme Court in 2003. But I think there are good arguments, both internal to New Zealand and externally, for New Zealand to break even freer of this relationship. So internally, New Zealand's demographics are changing. Pākehā, which is the Maori word for white New Zealanders of European background, will shortly be a minority in Auckland, in New Zealand's largest city, or are projected to shortly be a minority. And there is a growing Maori, Asian, and Pacifica population. So Maori are around 17% of New Zealand. The Asian population is about 15% of the New Zealand population, and the Pacifica population is about 8%. And there are also larger communities now from Latin America and the Middle East and Africa. On top of those demographic shifts, I think the political dynamics are shifting in New Zealand, and this is a little more qualitative, but in recent years, there's been a stronger impulse towards decolonisation. In fact, Tulia and Tina have been important voices in that discussion, which is about understanding and undoing colonisation of the kinds that Tulia and Tina were just talking about. I think there's been some resurgent class consciousness in New Zealand, and sometimes that's contrasted with a class society in the UK. And some of these changes have come through into policy. So, for example, Jacinda Ardern's government, which Nina mentioned, has committed to teaching New Zealand history more fully in schools, and has made a commitment to greater teaching of te reo Māori or the Māori language in schools. So these are some reasons why we might think from a New Zealand perspective there needs to be a shift, but also externally thinking about where the UK is moving, I think there are good reasons to shift. I think the UK is no longer, if it ever was, a kind of political model for New Zealand, and I think the failings of the UK during coronavirus have shown that up. The writer Pankaj Mishra has talked of the UK as well as the US as flailing as well as failing states. And then also the UK and its foreign policy, like the US, has been doubling down on a kind of foreign policy that strengthens relationships with white majority ex-colonies, in particular New Zealand, Australia and Canada. And this has happened in particular after Brexit. And we see this with, and there are lots of examples of this, but one example is the recent appointment of former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott as a trade envoy, the negotiation of free trade agreements with New Zealand and Australia is another example, as is lobbying within the UK for something called CANZ UK, a new formation of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the UK. I mean, this is a foreign policy that is nostalgic, it's imperialistic, it's white supremacist, and I think it's something that New Zealand should be very alert to. So in terms of how this relationship could be reimagined, in my view, there's a real need for caution from New Zealand about this kind of post-Brexit alliance building that is going on. And there's a need for New Zealand, in my view, to actively pursue relationships with other countries, new solidarities at both the government level and below the state level. And that could mean the setting up of new diplomatic relationships through embassies, but also support and funding for communities who are building different kinds of relationships, including Indigenous communities working across borders. I won't say anything more for now, but I guess in short, what I think this coronavirus moment throws up is an opportunity for New Zealand to do some rethinking. And I think rethinking New Zealand's relationship with the UK has to be one part of that.
Thank you, Max. I will come back to a question for you subsequently, but I want to ask Fairlie, whose chapter is Precious Lessons for New Zealand's Contributions to Peace Building, a little bit more about New Zealand's role internationally, because New Zealand has often seen as a country that's fair, independent and impartial. Do you hold or agree with this? Is this true, this reputation? And if not, why not?
Kia ora, everyone. Thanks, Nina. It's just so exciting to be involved in a conversation about New Zealand's role in the world that itself is so global. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. To the question, I think New Zealand certainly has a reputation for being fair, independent and impartial as an actor in international relations. Another way of asking that question is, do we deserve it? Or has it sometimes been assigned to us because of certain good examples or symbolic acts or images that the rest of the world has picked up from of who we are and what we stand for? I think that in New Zealand's history on the global stage, there's certainly a lot of really exciting examples of activism perhaps and independence in certain stances, defense of human rights in certain contexts. So, activism for nuclear non-proliferation is always a popular example, etc. But if I'm going to restrict myself to the role of, for example, New Zealand's security systems and our security forces, which is more my specialization and also what my chapter was about, I'd have to say that this reputation is certainly a lot more mixed, as our security services, a lot of people are sometimes surprised to learn, have long histories of abuse, both at home and abroad. At home, we have the New Zealand's military roots are as a colonialist force of violence, and that's an aspect of the institutional history which has only been partially addressed. We have many sad incidences of abuse of policing, and also a surprisingly large number of instances of invasion of privacy and abuse of civil rights by intelligence services in our history behind us, which is also something that surprises people often, and this surprises me, at home as much as abroad. And perhaps that's something to do with the way that we consider ourselves to be a peaceful country, and therefore we often don't submit the security sector in New Zealand, its role at home as abroad, to the kind of scrutiny that it really, really needs. We like to believe that our security services are relatively anodyne, that where there are sins and mistakes, these are sins of omission and neglect rather than malice or ill intent. But really, that's a very lazy answer to that question. And what we need to do, in my opinion, in New Zealand is to take responsibility to ensure that we have much more robust systems of democratic control, oversight and accountability in place across our security sector actors, both at home and pertaining to their role abroad. And that's something that we've moved towards a little bit in the sense that there's been massive changes to the way New Zealand's intelligence governance systems work over the last decades, which is both encouraging but also sorely needed. And these processes are never finished either, which is partly why we as a conversation, a community of people interested in New Zealand's role in the world and the nature of our democracy, we need to be much more engaged with the details of this conversation. And the fact that there's very little discussion of this in New Zealand's public sphere is one of the reasons why these failures are possible, and also something that we can do better at. So I think, you know, a really important point to retain here is that the role of security services in a democracy is a critical role of public service. There are public services that are critical to defending rule of law, protection of human rights, the safety of the population, and the safety of the nation. However, when they fail at their jobs, all of those things are endangered. So walking this tightrope is always a challenge. And in every system in the world, every security sector, there will be failures. Mistakes are inevitable. But the quality of a democracy, the quality of a democratic security sector should be measured by how security institutions react when those failures come to light. And that speaks really to the importance of having an active civil society community that's well informed about these issues, that's providing accountability, having a strong system of parliamentary oversight, having media who are well informed, responsible in their reporting and engaged with these issues to bring to light scandals. Cycles of scandals are often the way many democracies solve these problems. If we can always then return to the question of how to provide security as a public service, it can be a force for good rather than a signal of deterioration. And I think, you know, there's one example of this most recently, which we've really talked a lot about in preparations for this book, but also New Zealand's role in the world, which was Operation Burnham in 2010 in Afghanistan, which came to light as a really abhorrent incident where the New Zealand Defence Forces were involved with civilian casualties and also allowing suspects to be handed over to authorities who were then subsequently tortured. These are terrible violations of both the spirit and the rules by which New Zealand was engaged in this operation. But that entire unfortunate situation was also made much worse and became a scandal and a crisis of a different kind when the Defence Forces failed to acknowledge that mistakes were made, and that throughout the chain of command and into the political echelons, these terrible incidents were not addressed. And that is a really good example of how New Zealand can do a lot better in this sphere. And it's something we should also bring to the type of assistance which we offer abroad, which I'm sure we'll get to later in the conversation.
Thanks, Fairlie. And for those of you who are wondering about Operation Burnham, it was offences that occurred in Afghanistan. So it was part of the so-called US War on Terror, where New Zealand defence were sent or offered and sent alongside US forces. And it went right up to the ministerial level, and even one of the ministers saying that he'd, on this occasion, lost confidence in the armed forces to report such such issues of such gravity. So this Operation Burnham, certainly if any of you are interested in, is a massive failing of New Zealand's security and defence forces. So thanks for raising that, Fairlie. I have two more questions, one for each of you, before I'm going to open up. So I might get you to be shorter and crisper in these ones, so that we can have as much Q&A from the audience. And those of you who are joining via Zoom, please put your questions in the chat, because I won't look at any, the Q&A box, not the chat box. That's the Q&A box, because that's what I'll be looking to for your questions. Right, so Fairlie just raised this point about intelligence and security issues regarding New Zealand's role in the world. And Max, you also mention in your chapter that New Zealand should reconsider staying in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. That's the alliance with the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia that was formed after World War II. What would this actually mean? Would we then sever our ties with these countries completely? And if so, who would New Zealand turn to if it needed assistance? I'd be interested to hear your perspectives on that. Thanks, Max.
Thanks, Nina, and I'll try and be short and crisp. So I think there's a view of New Zealand that perhaps some of you in the audience might have as sort of a set of distant islands. And then there's also a view within New Zealand that I think Fairlie referred to of that we have an independent foreign policy. And I think we need to challenge both of those narratives, because I think actually New Zealand is part of a series of networks and is linked into a series of relationships around the world that challenge that view that we're completely independent or distant. And one of those networks is this Five Eyes security and intelligence network that Nina's just mentioned. Just to say a bit about what I propose in the chapter is really, I think, first of all, we need a more open debate about the Five Eyes. As Nikki Hager, a New Zealand journalist who was one of the first people that wrote about the Five Eyes across the world in a book in 1996 said, very few people talk about the Five Eyes, what it does, its pros and cons. And I think we need a debate about the value of this alliance and whether it's worth continuing in. And I actually think the burden should be on the proponents of the Five Eyes to make the case for staying in the network, partly because this involves surveillance and threats to individual rights, as Fairlie noted, partly because there are some signs of failings, including arguably the March 15th mosque attacks, which are still under investigation from a commission of inquiry, but which many have said tragically involved intelligence failings towards kind of far-right white supremacists. Just briefly, because I don't want to go on for too long, it's often said that New Zealand gains the most from being in this alliance because New Zealand is the smallest country in this alliance. But I think we need the evidence to bear that out to the extent that that's possible. And I think I've also heard that because New Zealand is a small junior partner, New Zealand has to stretch further in order to show that it deserves its place in that alliance. I think we need to have a debate about whether democratic oversight and accountability of the kind that Fairlie mentioned is the right way forward. As Fairlie said, there have been legislative changes in recent years, or whether we need to withdraw from the alliance altogether. And then to come to Nina's question, I think that withdrawing from this would have to follow public debate, and it wouldn't necessarily involve severing ties altogether with the other countries who are part of this alliance. It would just be part of a kind of strategic reorientation, which I sort of started to discuss in my first answer. And as for who would we turn to, I mean, I think the premise of that is that the Five Eyes Alliance is providing some kind of essential support at the moment, and I think we actually need more proof of that, but there are a whole range of other options. Not every country is in an alliance of this kind, and I think that's got to be part of the debate going forward. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Matt. Fairlie, and following up on your point about New Zealand's role in international conflicts, I mean, you mentioned one tragic instance was Operation Burnham in Afghanistan. What more could New Zealand be doing, if we indeed should be doing more, to resolve international conflicts? And given your expertise on security sector reform and that your chapter focuses on that, maybe you want to elaborate a bit more on what constitutes good international assistance, specifically in reforming the security sector.
Thanks, Nina. Gigantic question, but let me just say there is a lot that New Zealand could be doing, and especially New Zealand's role and this reputation, which we need to do more to earn, of being good, fair, independent and impartial international brokers, could be a real boon to New Zealand if we did decide to become more of a broker in international peace. And there's several ways that we could do that. So, and it would involve really building on things that we're already doing, but bringing a new coherency to things that we're already doing by making this type of goal really an explicit values-driven objective for the types of policies that we're developing. And at the moment, unfortunately, in New Zealand, that's not the case. At the moment, we have different aspects of our development assistance, of our defence assistance, our defence cooperation, our security assistance, which are spread out under different objectives, and they don't come together to form a really coherent policy that would look clearly and at how what we're trying to do affects the places where we're trying to help. So just a little caveat on that, when we say the word security sector reform, it's easy to think that it means reform of the security sector, but that's not what it means. What it means very specifically is it's a normative commitment, a normative definition to making security forces more accountable in the context of democratic governments. Now, unfortunately, what passes for security sector reform, not just under New Zealand's policies, but I'd say most international assistance policies, are the types of security assistance which make security sector actors more effective, but not more accountable. And that's a technical way of saying we're making them more dangerous. Because a security sector that can be very effective at repression, can be very effective at abuse, can be very effective at torture. That's not what we're aiming for here. And the failure to bring that commitment to democracy and accountability, rule of law, human rights into the heart of defence support is a failure that we've seen across the board, and something that New Zealand could focus on and lead on if we wanted to. Similarly, Thomas Nash's epilogue in the book, and also New Zealand Alternative report that we collaborated on, raises the possibility of New Zealand creating a conflict prevention unit, which could be the type of place where that kind of policy could come from. And just to make the link there with the intelligence aspect of it, being a member of a major international cooperative network on intelligence gathering could actually be a boon to that kind of peacemaking role if it were set within the type of governance framework, the type of democratic governance framework, which would ensure that it aligned with our values rather than the values of other actors. Sorry, that wasn't very short and crisp.
It's great. I'm going to turn over to our audience now, both the one in front of me, and there are no Q&A questions in the Zoom chat, but please feel free to ask questions online. Anyone in the room have a question? I know we've covered a lot of ground, and please introduce your name and where you're from. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, I'm Conor O'Brien from Connecticut. I am an MA student studying American foreign policy here, first year. This is one for the whole panel. As New Zealand confronts its relationship with the United Kingdom and its colonialist past, do you believe that New Zealand should embrace republicanism and rid itself of a European monarch?
Great. I'm going to collect a couple if I can get some more. So should New Zealand become a republic and get rid of the Queen of England as our head of state? One more at the back.
My name is Joe Amuller. I'm from Colorado, and I'm an first-year MA student studying energy, resources, and environment. I'm curious to the panel, as you've talked a lot about, especially from Tina and Tulia, but also the other panelists, if New Zealand is to take a direction in which it confronts more of its colonialist past and its relationship with the Pacific, do you see the future foreign policy agenda and how it's being portrayed in a positive light in the media as an opportunity maybe to empower other nations in the dialogue for energy and climate change, or do you see it to maybe capitalize its position in the media and maybe see Jacinda take, if she's reelected, a harder stance with its neighbors such as Australia in terms of emissions and its role as a diplomatic power in the Pacific?
Great question. And yep, go for it.
Hi, my name is Zach Nelson. I'm an American, but grew up in Singapore my entire life. And a question that I have is mostly for you, Tulia, looking at peacekeeping operations of New Zealand security forces, especially in a regional context. I'm thinking of Timor-Leste brokering the Bougainville peace accord in Papua New Guinea, and whether those two instances, and that's just based on my own ignorance of what I know of New Zealand's role in the region, would constitute kind of positive instances of New Zealand's role in peacekeeping in a regional sphere, and if there are other ones that we should be aware of. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's hold there. I don't have any more in the Q&A. Max, do you want to start? The Republic question might be an appropriate one for you, and obviously feel free to elaborate on the second question about New Zealand's role vis-a-vis the Pacific and colonialism. Oh, can't hear you yet, Max, sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for the questions. So yeah, just taking the Republican question first. Yeah, I would like to see that debate taken forward in New Zealand, and there have been stirrings towards it for decades. I think last week Barbados announced that it was becoming a republic. There are a few things to work through for New Zealand specifically. One issue that often comes up is that Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in 1840 between Maori and the Crown, has 3 articles. It's essentially a guarantee of Crown government in exchange for Maori sovereignty and equality for Maori. But that involves a special relationship between the Crown and Maori. And what's often raised is, if New Zealand were to become a republic, would that affect the status of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi? I think a number of people, including Maori legal scholars, have written on this, and I don't think that's an insurmountable barrier, but that's one that requires Maori to be leaders in this conversation, and to be certain that that Te Tiriti would be upheld, because that treaty has been violated kind of throughout New Zealand's kind of recent history. And there are a whole range of other arguments, but I think that kind of consistent with what I said earlier, New Zealand has got to see ourselves as more than just a kind of little Britain in the South Pacific, and New Zealand now has demographic differences, different political dynamics, and I think all that is consistent with moving forward. But it won't be easy, and there's a strong kind of pro British sentiment in New Zealand, as was shown recently when a referendum to change the flag failed. So anyway, those are just some thoughts on that question. And then just briefly on the question, secondly, about New Zealand using its kind of positive media to push Australia and in the Pacific. I think it's maybe, first of all, important to kind of think critically about the positive coverage that New Zealand has gotten recently. So New Zealand has certainly done well through COVID, and I don't want to deny that, but it is interesting to ask why New Zealand in certain international outlets has gotten more coverage than other countries, say Vietnam, for example. And I think one possibility is that New Zealand it is a kind of link to imperialism, and that New Zealand is a white majority former colony of the UK, English speaking, which and kind of sharing broadly the political commitments of outlets like The Guardian and the New York Times. So I think that's all just to say, I guess New Zealand's been lucky to get so much attention, and now the question is, can that be harnessed to positive ends, and how? Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, has done quite well actually to push Australia on issues of offshore detention, and has caused kind of some debate in recent months and years there, but and has also called climate change kind of her generation's nuclear free moment, thinking back to what Fairlie said about nuclear free campaigning being important in New Zealand's history. But I think New Zealand could be doing more to speak with Pacific states and for their interests, and including internationally, and pushing Australia harder, given that Australia has been intransigent. But maybe I'll leave Fairlie to say more on either of those two questions and the third.
Great, Fairlie, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, great array of questions. Yeah, I wouldn't have much to add to the question of becoming a republic beyond what Max noted about how this reflects the status of the treaty. But yeah, I would hope that there are innovative and creative ways for us to think forward through that issue, because I think it's going to become something that's increasingly pressing as time goes by, as the international situation changes. I mean, the interesting question about what it means for New Zealand to be confronting its own history of colonialism in the international sphere. I actually think that really relates to Nina's second question about the role we could play as a potentially more active peacemaker in the world, because the truth is that we do have a long history of violent and confrontation within our own country, and it's not something that's resolved. It's something that's constantly being resolved, and we're constantly looking for new non-violent ways to do that. And as a population and as a set of institutions, we're always learning, and that learning gives us a basis for empathy and also a basis of experience that we could also use to enhance in a role of leadership in that sphere, if that was something that New Zealand decided to seek out. I don't know, Nina, do you want to do the peacekeeping question now?
Yep, go for it.
Yep. So yeah, good question about Timor-Leste. Actually, I would probably say that New Zealand has a long history of being involved in international peacekeeping efforts, and since the very founding of the United Nations, and including a very first peacekeeping mission, which is still ongoing in the Middle East, the Truce Observation Mission. But I would say probably the high point, the high watermark of New Zealand's commitment to international peace building, perhaps liberal peace building in general, would have been involvement in the Timor-Leste operation. I think there were a lot of good things that came out of that in terms of experience. Unfortunately, I don't see much of the experience and lessons that we got out of that experience on an institutional level were carried forward to our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, where it seemed much more that the approach and the policies were subsumed under a massive international effort, which was orientated much more towards a kind of counter-terrorism framework more than a peace-building framework or a sort of commitment to liberal democratic values. In one way, that's to do with the international conditions, but it's also to do with the fact that New Zealand wasn't perhaps independent enough in its assertion of how it wanted to be involved in those operations. Besides that, though, there are some good examples across the Pacific, and in particular in assistance with police reform. What notably comes to mind is New Zealand's role in police reform in the Solomon Islands through the Ramsey mission, the regional assistance mission there. But yeah, I think there is more that could be done, and I think that New Zealand could be more assertive in playing a leading role in its commitment to peace and security support abroad, and that would buttress a lot of the work that we seek to do in other areas, which remains unfortunately disconnected, in my opinion.
Thanks, Fairlie.
Nina, could I just add a really quick point? Not disagreeing with anything Fairlie said, but just on the republicanism point, I'm sure Tina Ngata would mention this if she were on the call, having spoken to her about it before. But on republicanism, there's been a really exciting push for constitutional transformation in New Zealand, led by Maori. And there's an amazing report, if anyone is interested, which you can get online, called Matike Mai Aotearoa. Maybe I can send through a link that Nina could share for anyone that's interested, with the idea that next year there'll be a major constitutional conversation in New Zealand. And it's just a really interesting set of proposals for how New Zealand could have a different kind of constitution that draws on South America and other Indigenous experiences. So just to add to that on republicanism.
Thanks, Matt, for that. And on the other point that was raised about New Zealand and peacekeeping, and Fairlie mentioned a couple of times, there is a report that we co-authored 2 years ago on New Zealand's role in peace building and conflict mediation, which I can also share links to. And it's a report that we wrote as a collective called the New Zealand Alternative that Max, myself, Fairlie, and a couple of the other authors are part of a think tank in New Zealand. So we have engaged in some of the questions that third question raised. Now I have one question in the online Zoom room. I want to see, is there any other questions here in the audience as well? Okay, one in the back, great. So while the person in the back's waiting for the microphone, I'm going to ask Sneha's question. She says, hi all, this is Sneha from India. My question is, how can other countries, including former colonial ones especially, learn from and develop partnerships to further Indigenous rights with regard to corporate capture or takeover of the political, economic and social sphere related to climate justice? So the key, I guess, to this question is, how can other countries learn from and develop partnerships to further Indigenous rights? And we'll collect one more question at the back. So introduce yourself and your question.
Yep. I asked a question earlier. My name is Joe. And so in line with talking about defense sector reform in New Zealand, in the United States, currently we're experiencing quite a bit of reform in terms of our defense strategy. We're reorienting away from the war on terror. For example, the United States Marine Corps has completely redesigned its force structure to be more mobile and agile in the Pacific, and has really oriented itself back into that space. And so I was curious how you might envision a reconciliation of redesigning colonial structures that exist within the New Zealand defense sector, as it also faces a new security threat from China in the Pacific. We've traditionally, at least in the United States, always envisioned New Zealand as a regional partner and do frequent training exercises with New Zealand in the Pacific. And I was curious, if you are orienting maybe away from lockstep defense strategies with both the UK and with the United States, how you envision maybe a new defense structure with a very similar shared security threat in the region.
Thanks for that, Joe. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm David Horner-Eibler from the United States. I apologize for my ignorance on this topic of New Zealand, but I'm very grateful to the time that you've spent with us tonight. I guess my question would perhaps be best answered by the two people who aren't here right now. But a lot of the aspirations that I feel that you have been, kind of talking about as New Zealanders, hearken to the better angels of New Zealand's nature. Perhaps this idea that you can be a positive force for good and change in the Pacific in international relations. There feels to be very high expectations from you as a people towards your government, towards your security services, towards your own reputation that you feel that you should live up to, which I find pretty impressive. What do you think the role is of the Indigenous people in New Zealand in kind of creating and making real these desires of a country of New Zealand to have a more peaceful and perhaps more responsible outlook on the world? And how can the indigenous leaders of the country help kind of bring that about?
Great. And I acknowledge, and I'm sorry we can't have Tulia and Tina here to respond to these questions. I know they would really enjoy it, but I feel like asking people to get up at 5 in the morning is a little bit much. But I would say before we get responses, both of them have written quite extensively, and I'm happy to share links to their work because that's the best way to engage with their ideas. Tina Ngata publishes actually quite frequently in The Guardian. Tulia Thompson has pieces in a New Zealand publication called Te Tangata. And I would really encourage you who are interested in these questions to read them directly. Given that we can't do that, I don't know if Fairlie and Max, if you have a preference, don't feel that you need to respond to all 3 questions. I think we had Sneha's question around Indigenous rights and the role of corporate capture. So that was the first questions about how countries develop partnerships, I guess, internationally. We had the question about New Zealand's security and the threat of China, if one does agree that that is the threat, from Joe, and then the question of the role of Indigenous peoples. So Fairlie, Max, do you have a preference for which of those 3 questions you would like to answer? And
Thanks, Nina. I guess since it was addressed to me directly, I'll go with the New Zealand's defence structure orientation one. I think, you know, a good defence structure has to be obviously the result of a really good, robust process of national security strategy making, policy making and strategy making, right? So without trying to kind of off the cuff come up with a new defence structure for New Zealand on that basis, what I would say is that it's a curious fact that New Zealand, as one of the, you know, an oceanic nation of islands, has always focused most of its defence attention on land forces. And partly that's been wound up to do with our way we've seen our role in the world. It allowed us to send forces abroad to participate in imperial wars, for example. But that was a long time ago. And while that role was at some point reimagined as support to international peacekeeping operations and peacebuilding operations, there's a larger question to ask: what would New Zealand's defence structures look like if we reimagined what our risks to our security are? So, for example, if we took up some of the values that are at the heart of kind of the progressive vision for New Zealand that is behind this book and the work of the New Zealand Alternative, we might expand our notion of what security means. So, for example, what would our defence structures look like if we took threats to environmental security more seriously, and we integrated that in a more coherent way into the way that we thought about the role of our security and defence forces, and what that might, you know, concretely sort of thinking down the line, what that might look like is perhaps we need a lot more focus on enforcing the types of environmental regulations or international laws that exist to protect, for example, marine resources from illegal fishing and from exploitation and those kinds of questions. And I think part of the problem with and this is as much as I'll say on the other two questions, part of the reason why New Zealand hasn't done that, and part of the motivation behind this book and this project, is that a lot of our security policy thinking has been restricted to a rather small number of people who come from very similar backgrounds and very similar identities, and therefore have very similar answers to the same questions. So a call for sort of perhaps more diversity in the conversation and more engagement from a wider New Zealand public, I think, would help with that. And while that may seem quite esoteric in response to a question about how should we structure our defence forces, that is actually where that answer to that question, in my opinion, really needs to start, and for all societies, and including the US and some of the challenges you're seeing there in your own reform processes.
Thanks, Fairlie. Max, did you want to respond to the other two questions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not Maori. I'm a Pākehā white New Zealander, but maybe I can just make a couple of like brief comments, just very much from that perspective, based more on what others have said to me. So, who know more about this than me? But just first on Sneha's question on learning from and building Indigenous partnerships in relation to climate change. I think Maori have done some amazing work on climate change, and one group to look up, which I've had like some contact with, is Te Ara Whatu, which is T-E-A, new word A-R-A, new word W-H-A-T-U, which is an all Indigenous delegation that has been sent to the COP climate negotiations process in the last few years. They've got a kind of like online presence, and it would be worth looking them up. But one other angle on that question, noting that I'm not Indigenous, is that I think that New Zealand the New Zealand government and other settler colonial governments could do more, including as reparative acts, to resource the kind of Indigenous partnerships, or to give resources to Indigenous peoples to determine partnerships. So in my chapter, something that I mentioned, which is an idea suggested to me by Maori writers and activists, is that New Zealand could give more money to the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform at COP, which is a platform that people have been very critical of as being kind of insufficient, but is a platform that's meant to boost Indigenous voices. As far as I know, and from what I've heard from people that have attended COPs, the New Zealand representatives at COP have done not very much to support that platform, and that is a kind of Indigenous to Indigenous platform, I think, of the kind that you were talking about. Just briefly on the other question, again, I'm not in a position to say like what the responsibilities are. I think this was the wording of the question for Maori leaders to create or make real the visions. But what I would say from a Pākehā perspective is I think that Maori are already and have historically been making real alternative visions of politics. And I think the responsibility of non-Maori is to kind of keep up and to watch and learn from what has been done already. So I mentioned the example of Ngā Tika Mai Aotearoa, this report on constitutional transformation ideas. Another example, just a second example to mention, is there's been a land occupation in New Zealand at Ihu Mātau, which has been a struggle to preserve the heritage and sanctity of an area of Maori land that was stolen by the government, and there's been a kind of call to return it. It's an ongoing issue, but there a set of values are being modelled about protecting the land. And then just the very last thing to say is, as Nina said, there are a number of Maori writers who've written prolifically, and if anyone's interested in this, I just encourage you to seek them out. And again, I'm not the best authority on this, but people that I've learned a lot from are Moana Jackson, Moana Jackson, whose writing you can find online and who's very involved with Ngā Tika Mai, and then also Ani Makaere, who's written a lot and wrote an amazing book called Colonizing Myths, Maori Realities, Hirokuroko Whakaaro. And they're just two of many authors. Tina as well has a great website where some of these ideas will be expressed much better than I could express them.
Thanks for that, Max. I just want to add a couple of other comments from the book to that question, because Tina does address that, how are Indigenous peoples taking leadership, and she talks about how, and I quote from her, I'm incredibly proud of our whakahorua. Whakahorua is a boat. Te Matawa Maui trawling our eastern seaboard as the first marine microplastic trawl transit in Aotearoa waters in February. And she talks about how they're collecting microplastics and doing scientific research. She has a number of other examples in the chapter. And I should note the book is in the library, so that would be one place to seek it out. And one other concrete example in the book, which is actually something that Thomas Nash writes in the epilogue, is about how Pacific Island states in 2017 put forward a proposal to develop a fossil-free zone in the region. And Thomas Nash in his chapter, while he's not Māori or Indigenous, puts it out and says, in terms of our relationship with the Pacific, and in response to Snare's question, that we should be doing more to support these kinds of initiatives. And in fact, he makes the argument we need to ban fossil fuels and have an international treaty to ban them. So there are a couple of other tangible examples. We're almost coming up for time. I want to just canvass if there are any final questions in the room before we close off our discussion. Yes, one at the front.
Hello. So New Zealand left the security arrangement with the United States and Australia, and as they're saying now, they're considering leaving the Five Eyes agreements. Do you believe that New Zealand, having done so, can still benefit as a free rider within these arrangements as a liberal democracy that has close ties with Australia, the United States, and their security apparatus?
So the question is essentially, if New Zealand were to break off from the Five Eyes alliance, would we still benefit from a relationship with those countries? Do you think that you could still, well, within that, and also just broader security implications? So, if the Chinese were to start attacking New Zealand shipping, for example, well, would the United States and Australia still step in as fellow democratic nations? Great, thanks for that provocative question. Does Max and or Fairlie want to respond to it? I have my own response, but as a moderator, I will hold back.
Fairlie, do you want to go first?
Sure. That was one of the points that, you know, I mentioned earlier. It's kind of curious that New Zealand has focused so much of its defence structure on land forces rather than, you know, you would expect us to be as an island nation, perhaps a nation with a large naval defence force. And in fact, obviously, one of the examples is that one of the responses to that question is that we have been able to free ride on the relationship between the US and Australia and their defensiveness against the sort of larger, the way that their strategic reading of the larger Asian setting, you know, because one reading of reality would be to say that any threat to shipping lanes in the Pacific or a land invasion of New Zealand would be too great a strategic threat for Australia or the US to stomach, and therefore it would be in their own interests to defend New Zealand against becoming a sort of staging point for an invasion of Australia, for example. And that's the kind of traditional sort of kinetic interpretation of why New Zealand can get away with that sort of what has been called a free riding defence policy. And that's, you know, there's some truth to that. You know, I once was in a presentation where a New Zealand defence official sort of held up a picture of the Pacific Ocean and said, all of this blue stuff, that's our defence policy. So that's one way to read it. I think that withdrawal from the Five Eyes arrangement would have significantly different security implications for New Zealand. And I think that that's something that we would need to think through in much more detail and with much more subtle nuance. And of course, one of the reasons where we should think about withdrawing from it is because subtle, nuanced debate about these things is very difficult in the public sphere because there's so little transparency, so little public accountability for the activities of that network and how it works and what New Zealand's role is. And New Zealand has not managed to put in place a system of intelligence oversight which would allow us to have faith in our own government's ability to look more closely at the role we're playing and whether or not it was really in New Zealand's best interest. So, but that's more of a domestic political question, I think, than a strategic security one.
Thanks, Fairlie. Matt?
Yeah, just building on that. I mean, I wouldn't want to suggest I think that New Zealand is actively considering withdrawing from the Five Eyes at the moment. I think the debate on this is quite marginal, but I think there should be more debate about this. But yeah, coming to your question about free riding, kind of consistent with what Fairlie was saying, I don't want to pretend that withdrawing from the Five Eyes would be an easy or uncontroversial act. So New Zealand taking a stand on nuclear free in the 1980s led to suspension from ANZUS and yeah, major diplomatic challenges that took a long time to work through. And so I don't want to sound flippant or naive. And I'm confident that if this debate were to move forward in a serious and nuanced way, which I think should happen, like Fairlie said, that there would be major obstacles thrown up, and that the case would be made that New Zealand would lose a lot from withdrawing from the alliance. And I wouldn't want to suggest that some kind of like free riding or like continuing intelligence gathering would be easy. What I would say is that I think we need to have that debate in a nuanced way, and that there might well be other benefits that came from a different kind of intelligence arrangement. So, for example, and to connect to something that Fairlie said earlier, I also worked on this report that we worked on peace mediation, and one thing that actually came up is that New Zealand's role in the Five Eyes may have impeded a greater role for New Zealand in mediating between countries, because New Zealand is seen as being associated with, in particular, the US and the UK. And so it may be that that a different kind of arrangement opens up opportunities for New Zealand to be a genuinely independent arbiter, and that's just one benefit that might flow from this. So, as with any international relations or foreign policy choice or move, this would come with trade-offs and a range of possible consequences that would have to be weighed up as part of the public debate. I sort of just used your question to jump off onto other issues, but hopefully that addresses part of it.
You're allowed that as a panelist. I just wanted to add one more thing, which I think is important to realize in an audience that maybe doesn't know a lot about New Zealand, is New Zealand historically had very strong ties with China. So perceiving China automatically as a threat is not how all New Zealand politicians will agree we need a strong relationship with China. And it's our largest trade partner. New Zealand was the first country to sign, or first developed country to sign a free trade agreement with China and support it on the WTO. And in fact, even one of our trade minister claimed in the last few years that New Zealand wants to create a bridge between the US and China. That may be a little bit naive, it's a little bit big, but more importantly, it's a very difficult balancing act for a small country like New Zealand to take that on. But I think it's important to recognize that the position currently within New Zealand government, both the centre-right, the centre-left party, is that we need strong relationships both with China and the US. And I think that sort of leads me to kind of round off our discussion, because what we had right now was a really interesting conversation about a small country, yes, New Zealand, but I think it does have wider repercussions. And one of the things that we hope with this book and with this discussion is that we engender both domestically and internationally more conversations around foreign policy, and that's normal here at SICE. But in the New Zealand election that's currently happening, we had the leaders' debate last week, and there was not a single mention of foreign policy issues. I guess a little bit like the US, foreign policy is far from people's minds when they make decisions about who they're going to vote for. And in fact, most of the major parties except one haven't even got any manifesto up on their website. So it's not just that leaders aren't talking about it, there's real dearth of thinking. And so the conversations that we're trying to put forward and the thinkers we're trying to highlight are really to inject within New Zealand a more healthy debate about some of these issues. And as both Fairlie and Max have said, it's not that we necessarily have all the answers, although we have a few ideas, but we want there to be a bigger and more broader debate. And I think that's something very much that one could reflect on within each of your own countries, about who is engaging in these debates about what foreign policy should look like in your own country, and how do you listen to different people, how do you engage different voices in that debate that may not typically be heard. So I want to acknowledge on that note some of the other authors in the book who weren't here tonight. We also have Zheng Dazheng, who's a Chinese immigrant to New Zealand, who's written a really interesting chapter on New Zealand-China relationship and rethinking it from a people-to-people perspective. We have Amelia Evans, who is a New Zealander who's written a lot on corporate responsibility, business and human rights. So for those of you interested in how would any country really get their businesses to respect human rights abroad, you could look to her chapter. And then we've already mentioned Thomas Nash's epilogue, which refers to some of these questions around climate justice and also the conflict mediation report. So with that, I'd like to give a warm, large thank you to the speakers. And also to the audience, both those of you who are joining us remotely on Zoom. We've had around 10 people at least, so it's great. And I know that this event will be going live, or rather will be available, so there'll be other people watching it subsequently. And to those of you in the room, thanks very much for coming out. If you're interested to hear more about the book, I'm happy to chat about it at the end of the session, one-on-one, obviously with social distancing. And there is a copy already in the library, and there are sections of it that you can read online. If you want to download it, you can get it from Bridget Williams' BWB on Kindle. I think the post takes a little while. It took me about 2 months to get my own hard copy of this, unfortunately, right now. But thanks again to you all, and thanks particularly Max and Fairlie, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Nina. See you.
Thanks.
And if anyone's interested, there's a great podcast called The Service, which is all about New Zealand intelligence and how New Zealand became a hot pot during the Cold War for spies, and how Russians were spying on the Five Eyes alliance through New Zealand because it was seen as the weak link. So yeah, it's a really gripping, true non-fiction podcast, The Service.